The BBC News at 10 now, with Huw Edwards.
Tonight at 10, the US imposes new restrictions on travellers from China because of renewed concerns about COVID. With thousands of new cases reported every day, China is accused of a lack of transparency about the true scale of their COVID problem. China's borders are to reopen next month, and the government in Beijing says reports of a new pandemic there are simply untrue.
The argument you mentioned is a biased smear campaign and political manipulation with a hidden agenda, which doesn't stand up to scrutiny and runs counter to the truth.
Well, this evening, the US joined other countries, including Italy, insisting on a new testing regime for passengers from China. Also tonight, Merseyside police appeal for new information following the fatal shooting of Huw Edwards, who was 26, on Christmas Eve. 2022 becomes the warmest year ever for the UK. We report on the impact on British wildlife. And John Bird, one of the masters of satire, has died after a long career that started in the 1960s.
I admit, in the privacy of this television studio, that all is not well within the government. Some of my colleagues have not performed as I expected them to. Even worse, some of them have.
Good evening. The United States has joined the list of countries imposing a new COVID testing regime on travellers from China. The recent decision by Beijing to reopen China's borders next month, despite a surge in COVID cases, has prompted a tough response from countries including Italy, Japan, Malaysia and Taiwan. US officials say that everyone arriving from China will have to provide a negative COVID test. The UK says it is monitoring the situation closely, but Downing Street said today it had no plans at present to change the rules. Our diplomatic correspondent Paul Adams has more details.
From the world's most populous nation, alarming scenes. China's hospitals overwhelmed, COVID infections soaring. The country's abrupt decision to dismantle much of its strict COVID regime apparently yielding worrying results. Wards full of desperately ill people. Outside this hospital in Chengdu, a queue for emergency services. Government officials say the situation is under control. That's not what these pictures suggest. At the Dongjiao funeral home, one of the city's biggest, more evidence of the scale of the problem. One funeral procession after another. Workers here say they're so busy they have no time to eat. And yet China is opening up, about to relax rules for inbound travellers and making it easier for Chinese citizens to travel abroad. Welcome news for travel companies after 3 bleak years.
Since this morning, we've had lots of inquiries from our customers. They're asking whether they can travel abroad normally again, whether they'll need to quarantine on their return, and when international tourism will return.
It's hard to know just how bad China's coronavirus situation really is. China says it recorded 5,231 new COVID cases yesterday and just 3 deaths nationwide. But people are no longer required to declare infections to the authorities, so the official figures are unlikely to tell the full story. And so, neighbouring countries, Japan, Malaysia, Taiwan and India, all worried about the possibility of importing COVID cases, have already announced tighter measures for Chinese travellers, including the requirement for negative tests. Tonight, American officials, citing a lack of Chinese transparency, have followed suit. In a week's time, all people arriving from China will have to have proof of a negative test. And in Europe, Italy has become the first country to say it's making coronavirus tests mandatory. Back in Beijing, officials reject any suggestion that China has lost control.
The argument you mentioned is a biased smear campaign and political manipulation with a hidden agenda, which doesn't stand up to scrutiny and runs counter to the truth.
After last month's nationwide protests, this is the image China wants to project, a country finally turning its back on the virus and on its own draconian response. But China's long, hard battle with COVID is far from over. Paul Adams, BBC News.
Merseyside police have made a new appeal for people to come forward with any information following the fatal shooting of a woman on Christmas Eve. Huw Edwards, who was 26, was shot outside the Lighthouse Inn pub in Wallasey just before midnight on Saturday. Police have suggested that she was not the intended target of the attack. Our correspondent Danny Savage reports.
The Lighthouse pub is still as it was on Christmas Eve. Lights on, TVs on, vehicles still in the car park. Time has stood still at this murder scene. Some who were here at the time call by to leave flowers, scared of those responsible, fearful of appearing on camera.
It was so loud, nothing like a firework. I've never heard anything like it. There was girls hiding in the toilets. We were under the table. I saw a guy running with his leg bleeding, and that's when we knew it was serious. A lot of people ran out to try and help. I stayed inside. We were scared. It was so scary.
26-year-old Huw Edwards was killed. Her family are devastated. Someone with a gun fired at a group of drinkers outside the pub. They were sitting here by some patio heaters. Police are still looking for the weapon and information about who was responsible.
We will not rest until we bring the offenders to justice. And by that I mean the person who pulled the trigger of the gun in the most indiscriminate way in this public house on Christmas Eve. Anybody who was responsible for arranging, facilitating or harbouring this individual, and anybody who continues to withhold information on who has done this, or indeed where the weapon is.
2 people, a man and a woman, arrested 2 days ago, are still being questioned by detectives. It appears that police believe that someone is hiding the gun used in the shooting, and they are piling on the pressure to move this inquiry forward.
These people are cowards.
Merseyside police have today released this slick video, which they hope will spread across social media to flush out more information about who killed Ellie. A murder just before midnight on Christmas Eve has stunned this community. They feel scared. Police are now all over this neighbourhood, trying to reassure people. Danny Savage, BBC News, Wallasey on Merseyside.
2 men have been arrested on suspicion of murder after a 23-year-old man was fatally stabbed at a nightclub in Birmingham on Boxing Day. A 22-year-old man was detained in Birmingham and a 21-year-old in London. Cody Fisher was a non-league footballer and a school sports coach. His family said that his death had broken their hearts, and West Midlands police are appealing for more information from the public. At the Vatican today, Pope Francis has urged people to pray for his predecessor, Pope Emeritus Benedict, whose health has worsened. Pope Francis was speaking at today's general audience. Officials say that the former Pope's health has deteriorated overnight. Benedict XVI, who's 95, left office in 2013. The first pope to resign in 6 centuries. Let's join our correspondent Bethany Bell, who's in Rome. Bethany, what is the latest then on the condition of Benedict?
We don't have too many details about his condition since this morning, when the Vatican put out a statement saying that he was receiving constant medical attention and also that his condition was under control. Pope Francis this morning said that Benedict was very sick, and he urged Catholics around the world to pray for Benedict in his witness, to sustain him in his witness to the Church until the end. We know also that many people will have him in their thoughts. Now, Benedict became Pope in 2005. He succeeded John Paul II. And in 2013, as you say, he became the first Pope to resign since 1415. His papacy had been marked by conservative, traditional Catholic doctrine. He spoke out against abortion, against contraception, against homosexuality. And Pope Francis, who succeeded him, has a much more liberal approach. He frequently visits Pope Benedict, but sometimes the presence of a former pope in the Vatican has been seen as divisive.
Bethany, thanks very much again. Bethany Bell with the latest there on the condition of Pope Emeritus Benedict. 2022 will be categorised as the warmest year on record in the UK. That's according to the Met Office. This summer saw temperatures reach 40 degrees Celsius in some areas for the first time. The National Trust, which manages vast areas of land in England and Wales and Northern Ireland, says that the prolonged droughts and then the repeated storms have affected many species, as our climate editor Justin Rowlatt explains.
2022 began as the year was to continue with extreme weather. Storm Malik in January was followed in early February by Storm Eunice.
A day of record-breaking temperatures across...
But extreme heat was the defining feature of the year, with record high temperatures recorded across the country. Wildfires followed, devastating some habitats on National Trust land in the southwest, including rare heathland in Dorset. The fire left a large swathe of it completely barren.
But there is some good news. The National Trust has a well-established fire management strategy here, and the fire service got in here early and limited the scale of the fire, stopping it spreading. And there's something else as well, and you can see that best from the air. The area of natural ecosystem in this part of South Dorset has been expanding.
We have a much larger reserve, which means we've got better connectivity between those areas of land, and that means that wildlife can thrive. It's a more resilient landscape. Wildlife can move around freely in that landscape.
It wasn't just wild ecosystems that were affected by the hot, dry weather. Lawns and water features at some of the National Trust's most cherished gardens were hit too. It is a warning of what is to come, says the Trust.
We're going to have more frequent heat waves, we're going to have droughts, we're going to have torrential downpours, and the way the National Trust manages its land is part of the solution to making us all more resilient.
That means planting woodlands, reflooding bogs and, where possible, expanding other ecosystems. Species that have suffered this year include the UK's seabird colonies, very badly affected by the bird flu epidemic. Many bat species struggled in the intense heat of summer, and some species of fungi suffered too. But some species have thrived. Large blue butterflies in Gloucestershire, choughs in Cornwall also did well. They are a rare relative of the crow. It was a good year for autumn colour, as well as apples and nuts. And a pair of beavers in Somerset had kits in the spring. They're called Russo and Toon, after two of the England team that did so well in the Euros.
Let's talk a little bit more now, and Justin has joined me here. What's been notable in your view about this year?
Well, we didn't just have a hot summer, we had a hot spring, a hot autumn and a hot winter too. And it didn't just affect the wildlife, as you saw in my report, we were all affected. The Met Office issued its first ever red warning for extreme heat, advising us all to stay at home. And do you remember how the searing heat buckled train lines and fuelled wildfires? And if you thought it was bad here in the UK, it was even worse elsewhere in the world. Extreme heat drove what looks set to have been one of the worst droughts in Europe for hundreds of years, with water levels in mighty rivers like the Danube, the Rhine and the Loire running exceptionally low. We had terrible wildfires across the continent. Meanwhile, drought in Africa brought millions of people to the verge of famine, and temperatures in India and Pakistan topped 50 degrees Celsius in some places as a result of heat waves that scientists say were made 100 times more likely by climate change. In fact, we are expecting 2022 to have been amongst the hottest years ever recorded globally too. And Huw, as you know, the science says we can expect more of this extreme weather to come.
Okay, Justin, many thanks once again. Justin Rowlatt there, our climate editor. Now, a shortage of social workers for children is forcing councils throughout the UK to spend considerable amounts on hiring agency staff. Research for the BBC has revealed that spending on temporary staff rose by 30% over 5 years, from around £165 million to over £227 million. Our social affairs editor, Alison Holt, picks up the story.
This is the front door of Protecting Children from Harm in Coventry. Here they get between 200 and 300 calls a week from worried professionals or families.
When was it that they sent the email to you about them not coming back to school?
Social workers work alongside police and health professionals to keep children safe.
I think the best advice I can give is that you do see a solicitor and talk to them about not being able to see your baby and what they might be able to advise for you.
But with a national shortage of social workers, UK councils are having to employ more agency staff, the only way to cope with the record number of concerns being raised.
We do deal with a lot of complex issues, yes, and those are the families who are most likely to go on to our social work teams to receive a service from a social worker.
Freedom of information data collected by the BBC shows among the 125 UK councils which responded, spending on agency staff rose significantly over 5 years. Nearly £165 million was spent on temporary children's social workers in 2017. Although there was variation between authorities, by 2022 the overall figure had reached more than 227 million, up 38%. John Gregg runs children's services in Coventry. He says with budgets tight, extra spending on agency staff hits the amount they can spend helping families.
Regionally and nationally, the reality is if we're spending more money on children's services and vulnerable children, and we're spending on agency workers rather than a full range of services for children, it does mean that children are going to get less of a service. I also think there are probably impacts on other areas of council service delivery.
Richard Devine is a consultant social worker who's worked in council child protection for more than a decade. He says agency staff can be good, but he worries about the instability it brings to families when they know their social worker is temporary.
I've had to work with children and their families over a period of several months or more and needed to build up trusting relationships with them in order to get a clear understanding of what's happening for them and their family. And I think for agency social work, often they're not able to do that because of the short-term basis of their employment.
But with more children needing protection, the organisation representing social work agencies says the key problem is how to recruit and keep more social workers.
The demand for social workers has gone up over the pandemic. We need to fund that properly. We have a Chancellor who said that they're now looking at the workforce plan for the NHS. We need exactly the same approach to be taken in social care and social work.
The government is currently considering plans for major reform of children's services, including looking at the cost and use of agency staff. Alison Holt, BBC News.
In today's football, Manchester City have moved up to second in the Premier League table after they beat Leeds 3-1 at Elland Road, and it leaves City now 5 points behind the leaders, Arsenal. The actor and comedian John Bird has died at the age of 86. He was best known for satirical comedy, working with John Fortune and Rory Bremner as they exposed some of the absurdities of politics and public life. He won BAFTAs for his work in the early and late stages of his career. Our entertainment correspondent Colin Patterson looks back at his life.
I'd like your reaction to the remarks made by the Archbishop of Canterbury a few days ago when he said that people in your position, the top executives in Britain, were earning far, far too much money.
Well, I'd like to say that I yield to no one in my admiration for Dr. Carey, but at the same time, I would respectfully suggest that he is a sanctimonious old fart who can't add up.
John Bird and his great friend John Fortune were famous for their satirical sketches, working for more than 20 years with Rory Bremner. Their sections of the show usually featured one of them interviewing the other to highlight the pomposity of people in power.
Let's say you're just going along as normal in the market, and then, suddenly, out of the blue, one of these very sharp and sophisticated people says, "My God, something awful's going to happen! We've lost everything! Oh, my God, what are we going to do? What are we going to do?"
And what was wonderful watching the sketches, and I urge people to watch the sketches, is just seeing these two friends and how they made it look so effortless as they took apart government policy or took apart, the principles in public life in a way that just made you just clutch your sides with laughter.
John Bird was a star of the Cambridge Footlights in the 1950s, where he directed Peter Cook. They would become instrumental in the 60s satire boom. Politicians had suddenly become fair game to be mocked. He turned down the chance to present That Was the Week That Was, despite coming up with the name of the show, Instead, he recommended his flatmate, David Frost. John Bird became a TV regular on its sequel, Not So Much a Programme, More a Way of Life, where his impressions of the Prime Minister, Harold Wilson, helped win him his first BAFTA in 1966.
I admit, in the privacy of this television studio, that all is not well within the government. Some of my colleagues have not performed as I expected them to. Even worse, some of them have. What we do is
his partnership with John Fortune was underway, and they featured in a sketch with a young Alan Bennett about TV executives trying to think up new ideas for a show.
Well, look, couldn't we combine the two? Have a story about a fashionable discotheque in an old people's home. We'll call it Whiskey a Gaga.
Looking back on his career, John Bird once said, "I always think by now I should be having a late period. I've had an early period that's gone on."
Great talent of the satirist John Bird, who's died at the age of 86. Time is 21 minutes past 10. It's time to join Louise for the latest on the weather. Hi, Louise.
Hi there, Huw. Winds featuring over the next couple of days. There's also some rain around. This was earlier on, whipping up the sea, Lyme Regis, and I suspect there'll be more rough seas to come, particularly in tomorrow, with gusts of winds around 40 or 50 miles an hour. That means that we are likely to close out the year on a mild but rather wet note at times. The winds certainly a feature. There's still going to be a little bit of snow, but only to higher ground across Scotland primarily. And that's because the milder air flooding back in across the country as we speak. We're just hanging on to the blue tones into the far north of the country. That's where the area of low pressure is sitting at the moment. And around that low pressure, we've got these weather fronts just enhancing plenty of showers over the next few hours. So a little bit like a Catherine wheel dancing around that low. We'll see those showers filing in through the night tonight. So quite a lot of cloud around, some of the showers fairly extensive. That's going to keep those temperatures up. Frost and fog free first thing tomorrow morning, but there will be some showers pretty much from the word go. Most heavy, most frequent, likely to be across Scotland. Maybe the odd rumble of thunder mixed in there. A little bit of winteriness to higher ground, but it's primarily rain through Scotland, Northern Ireland and northwest England. Some showers a little bit further south across Wales and southwest England. Some of these will push inland with gusts of winds widely 40, 50 miles an hour on exposed west-facing coast. Inland, gusts of winds 30 miles an hour as well. So a blustery all day with sunshine and showers, and highs likely of 10 degrees. Now, as we're heading towards the all-important weekend, it looks really messy, I'm afraid, for celebrating for New Year's Eve and into New Year's Day. These weather fronts pushing their way into England and Wales. The best of the drier, perhaps fresher weather is likely to be into Scotland, but we're going to close out the year on a wet and windy note, and even into New Year's Day. Keep that umbrella close at hand. Huw.
Louise, thanks very much. Message received. Thanks to Louise there. And that's BBC News at 10 on Wednesday, the 28th of December. More analysis, of course, of the day's main stories on our website, on BBC News Online, all the latest updates. Meanwhile, all of my colleagues in the nations and regions standing by with the news where you are tonight. But from all of us here on the 10 team, thanks for watching and good night.